is a podcast that explores our relationship with the natural world. It consists of interviews, stories, and discussions that highlight the notion that nature is not a place one goes to, but rather a place one is already a part of, that we are nature. For those of you who are new to the podcast, my name is Stefan Van Noorden. On this episode of Nature Revisited, we welcome Eyal Frank, environmental economist, to the podcast. Eyal is an assistant professor at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago and an affiliated faculty at the Energy Policy Institute, also at the University of Chicago. As an environmental economist, Eyal works at the intersection of ecology and economics. His research studies how natural inputs contribute to different population functions and how market dynamics reduce natural habitats and lead to declining wildlife populations, as well as what are the costs, both direct and indirect, of conservation policies. His work draws on natural experiments from ecology and policy and uses econometric techniques to advance our understanding of the social cost of biodiversity loss. His research has led him to help discover how the near extinction of vultures in India led to the death of more than 500,000 people, and how the collapse of bat populations in North America led to the death of more than 1,000 infants. Eyal joins me from his home in Chicago to talk about that intersection between ecology and economics. Eyal, welcome to Nature Revisited. It's a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I have been looking forward to this interview for some time. So let's start with what led you to pursue a career in environmental economics.
A combination of many things, but at the core, I think that there are some really interesting problems at this intersection. The challenges that any additional economic growth often spells additional environmental degradation. When I started my undergraduate degree, I wanted to make sure that I have a solid understanding of both the natural sciences that would help me understand these problems, but also to have a good, rigorous framework to evaluate how to make these trade-offs. Should we be growing more? Is it worth advancing and expanding at the expense of nature? Starting at that time, I thought, wow, there are so many difficult problems here. How do we strike the right balance between human well-being and nature? I think it's going to be really fascinating and important to tackle these tough questions. And I consider myself so lucky to have this opportunity to contribute, hopefully meaningfully, to our understanding on these topics.
So what is environmental economics?
Many people will probably give you very different answers. Environmental economics is the field in the discipline of economics that studies how do markets and prices and incentives and different policies affect different environmental dimensions like pollution, energy use, or underground water levels. But also thinking about how people derive value from a variety of environmental amenities and how they're willing to trade off some of their incomes for more of those amenities. Undergraduates, when they take an Environmental Economics 101 class, many of the students in the class will come in thinking that the desired level of environmental pollution is always zero. And what we try to tell them is like there are all of these activities that They will generate pollution. Producing food is important. Having electricity is really helpful, like the recording of this podcast. But to generate enough electricity also means we're going to likely generate air pollution and contribute to climate change. If we think about the benefits and the damages, we realize, yes, we want the former and we maybe are willing to accept some of the latter. But the big question here is, are the benefits worth the damages? Is producing that last bushel of corn, is that benefit bigger than the damage it's creating from the use of fertilizers and pesticides? Or generating that last kilowatt hour unit of energy? Was it worth generating that, giving the air pollution and additional CO2 we emitted to the air? Those are the questions that the discipline or the field is trying to grapple with. What we hope when we talk to non-environmental economists about these problems is that we help them understand that there are some benefits, there are some damages. We want to be at a point where at that margin, at that last unit of production, at that last unit of consumption, we don't want to be at levels of production or consumption where the damages are much, much greater than the benefits that we're deriving from that.
So why do you think that it's important that people have a better understanding of the intersection between economics and nature?
We have a lot of tough choices to make as to how we're going to allocate space out there in the world between nature and economic development, and how we're going to spend the scarce resources that we have on conservation and preservation activities. If we're never going to have a tough conversation about what are the actual benefits that we're getting from the environment, getting from nature, then it's going to be very easy to just implicitly assume that they're zero. We're going to need evidence. We're going to need to have some rigorous understanding and knowledge to be able to make informed discussions about what it is that we gain and what is it that we lose when we make these different choices that affect the environment. That's where it's important, even if it's hard, to think in monetary terms, to put a dollar value on the different environmental amenities and services and benefits that we're getting. We need those values to be able to make sensible decisions.
So how did your research first lead you to the human cost of extinctions and species collapse?
I entered my PhD program, Columbia University, where you basically take almost the full set of classes you would in an economics PhD, and then a couple of more classes in the natural sciences. Into that program, knowing that I wanted to work at the nexus of economics and ecology, I actually didn't know exactly what problem I wanted to tackle at that intersection. And a lot of papers kept talking about the magnitude of biodiversity decline and how we're losing species left and right and how ecosystem functioning is declining. They kept saying that this is going to be potentially very harmful and even catastrophic for society and humanity. And then it dawned on me, they actually don't have a good quantification of a lot of these theoretical predictions as to what would happen to human well-being when ecosystems degrade. This is where climate scientists get saying, listen, climate change is happening, it's accelerating, it's going to be potentially very bad for society. You should be taking this very seriously. And it took a while for social scientists and for economists. And I thought, I've been training to be able to read and understand what ecologists are saying. I can connect those dots. I'm well positioned to reach these questions and bring the type of tools and thinking we have in economics to test out all of those really rich and detailed predictions that ecologists have made. And that really motivated me to think like, that's the area I can make meaningful contribution to.
So how many extinctions are there estimated annually? And how many of those do you think are driven by economic forces?
Oh, that's a very tough question to answer. First, it takes a really long time to declare a species as extinct. And we've been known to get that wrong. We have declared some species extinct only 10, 20 years after someone documented them out in the wild. What ecologists do, however, they estimate what they call extinction rates, and they compare those estimates to what they think were the extinction rates in the past, before our current modern levels of human pressure on the environment. Now, there isn't a fixed number that everyone agrees on, but I think that even the most conservative estimates are talking about extinction rates that are 100 to 1,000 times higher than what ecologists consider to be the normal background level. Extinction always happens out in nature, out in the wild. It's a question of the rate. How fast is it happening? And ecologists are telling us they're coming up to numbers that are 2 to 3 orders of magnitude larger than what they think that number was in recent history. Definitely broad agreement that habitat loss is one of the biggest drivers of both local and global extinction. But depending on the species, other factors might be much more important, such as climate change, invasive species, wildlife diseases, overexploitation. For different species, either one of these costs is more important than just habitat loss. And for some species, it's the combination of all of these different stressors that make it very problematic for them to continue. But in terms of how ecological losses also then spell out human losses, I think that can happen well before a global or even a local extinction. As soon as an ecosystem experiences what ecologists will call a functional loss, when a species can no longer perform their role in the ecosystem, we might be in trouble.
So, can you share some of the articles that you have written about the human cost of extinctions, starting with your article about the vultures in India?
Happy to. So vultures in the broadest sense are not necessarily the most iconic example of a mega charismatic animal that you would place on a poster when trying to raise resources, maybe for a conservation campaign. But what's very unique about vultures is that they're what's called obligatory scavengers. They only eat dead animals. And over evolutionary timelines, they've gotten incredibly good at doing so. They're able to descend on a dead cow and consume it effectively down to the bone in under an hour. In farm settings where there's a lot of dead animals to remove from the environment, they're incredibly crucial to keep that environment safe. One of those cases is in India, where there's a very large livestock industry. In the past, Indian farmers relied on vultures essentially showing up as the cleanup crew and removing those dead animals. Until all of a sudden, in the mid-90s, their population started to decline very rapidly. In less than 10 years, their populations of certain vulture species declined by more than 95%. We're talking about a decline of anywhere from 30 to 50 million vultures out in the wild to just a few hundred vultures left. That's a massive collapse of this role of removing dead animals from the environment. It took a decade to understand exactly what was causing this. One of these classic stories of unintended consequences where no one meant for this to happen. Root cause for this was the introduction of a painkiller with the active ingredient of diclofenac into livestock farming. It became so cheap that it became economically viable for livestock farmers to start using it and administer it to their cows and other livestock animals to treat inflammations and fevers and make them a bit healthier and more docile to manage. What we found out is that when those animals died and ended up in an animal landfill and vultures showed up to eat their dead bodies, any residue of that painkiller meant that those specific species of vultures developed kidney failure, and died within weeks. It was enough for a vulture to eat just one contaminated dead animal for them to die. In the absence of vultures, what happens if we keep production of livestock roughly the same? We now have a large body of dead animals that we need to get rid of somehow. So we now have rotting dead animal flesh out in the environment. All of those pathogens can leach into drinking water. We have more dogs and more rats because they're not competing for food with vultures anymore. We have potentially more animal bites from rabid dogs, and we have higher rates of infection. And all of that potentially spells out a higher disease and mortality burden for people. That's exactly what people in India were complaining about in the late 90s and early 2000s. And along with my co-author on that study, Anand Sudarshan, we decided to test out just how bad was this collapse of vultures for people. There was a massive collapse in this super important function that vultures were performing in the environment of keeping the environment safe for people. When that function was lost, and it was lost without the species becoming extinct, it meant that the environment was not as safe for people anymore. And the excess mortality burden was higher by about 4%, which we quantify to be about 100,000 additional excess deaths in the country, which is a very large and influential and meaningful number.
And then more recently, you did a study about the bat population in North America.
Yes. So with bats, they're very important in the ecosystem. In the United States, almost all of the bat species that we have are insect-eating bats. We have anywhere between 500 million to 1 billion bats in North America. Now, a single bat in a single night is going to eat anywhere between roughly 40 to 150% of their body weight in insects. Multiply that by about 500 million to 1 billion bats. We're talking about eating a lot of different insects and removing them potentially from our agricultural landscapes. This idea that bats are providing a source of biological pest control, and that helps farmers by allowing them to use a lower amount of insecticide, has been something that ecologists have argued for a long time. And they've predicted that if anything were to happen to bat population, then farmers would simply have to compensate by increasing their use of insecticide. So that's the setting of why bats might be very important in North America. And I hope the listeners to the podcast understand that we've had a hard time learning more about the magnitude and the importance of that. Unfortunately, it is to bat population. In 2006, we had this invasive fungus species that we think we know arrived from Europe unintentionally. Unfortunately for bats in the United States, they have never encountered this specific fungus. And what it does, it grows on the top layer of their skin, eats away at it. And for some bat species, that disruption means that they wake up prematurely during their winter hibernation. And that spells almost certain death for them. And starting from 2006, that fungus started to spread across different counties in different years. When I read about this, I thought this is a rare form of what we call a natural experiment. Something happened in nature that provides a useful approximation that I think I can use to learn about that object of interest, about that question, how much benefit are we getting from that? I went ahead and analyzed data on pesticide use and saw that, yes, farmers do start increasing their use of insecticide in the years after the arrival of that fungus to their county, after bats start dying off. When I tested to see what happened to infant mortality rates, I saw this meaningful increase also of about 7-8% in infant mortality rates in the county that were affected by this bat die-off only after bats started dying off. So that helps us understand that even if we're worried that bats are not the most charismatic, cute, and fuzzy animals out there, although I think they're very cute, they're providing us with this tremendous benefit of suppressing pests on agricultural fields, which then allow farmers to reduce their insecticides relative to a world where we don't have these bats around.
As long as there are people, there will be economies. Do you think it possible to have an economy that truly considers non-human needs as well as the human ones?
I think that also really depends on how far we think that we should be considering non-human needs. I want to make it very clear. I don't think that environmental economists or economists in general think of themselves as having the right answer to what that value judgment should be. Or at least we don't think that we have an advantage over other disciplines and other schools of thought when thinking about how to balance human and non-human needs. There is a growing field that thinks about animal welfare, especially in the scope of animal agriculture. What should we think about their welfare level, or their well-being in that process? Or when you think about animals out in the environment, how do we think about their material or comfort well-being when making different decisions? And it's a very interesting field to think about because we can't exactly get straight answers from animals. We can't exactly ask, so how do you feel about that policy or that policy? They're terrible at responding to surveys. We have ways to observe behaviors that we think correlate with some level of cognitive performance.
So in 1973, the U.S. government passed the Endangered Species Act. What do you think has been the impact, both positive and negative, of that legislation on the economy?
I want to start by just sharing about how the act came into being. There were previous versions of legislation that were trying to do the same thing, but didn't have a lot of authority or tools to accomplish what the Endangered Species Act is able to accomplish. A large part of how powerful the Endangered Species Act is in the United States comes from its history. When it was going up in Congress to be voted on, there were two versions, one in the House and one in the Senate. A version that was almost identical to the other version, but was using one key word that opened the gates in a way to consider a cost-benefit analysis. And that was the version that was voted on and adopted and accepted. They were not thinking that they were voting on an act that spelled protection and conservation and prevention of extinction, regardless of the economic cost. Most of the people voting on the Endangered Species Act at the time thought they were voting on something that's going to protect bald eagles, grizzly bears. They thought they were voting on something very limited, which is why it passed nearly unanimously in both the House and the Senate, with very little objection from any big industrial lobby. In the 50-year history of the Act, there have been two prime areas that people have loved to hate on the Act: job losses and land values. In some of the work that I've done, I've looked at one of the most iconic cases about job losses and the Endangered Species Act of the northern spotted owl in the Pacific Northwest. And we have been fighting and debating about what those protections have meant for the logging industry in the Pacific Northwest. And we have the data. We can look at what happened. We saw that roughly 30,000 jobs were lost. This is a roughly 28% reduction. This is not zero. This is not 100%. Another area is land value. Some work I have with co-authors, we try to evaluate how exactly have land values responded to this set of regulations. not for just one species at a time, but for all of the species across all of the land market, and thinking carefully about what happened inside the protected area and also what happened outside of the protected area. It's very hard to say that the Endangered Species Act lowers land values. It is not the case that home values or land values always decline everywhere and anywhere where the act has some purview.
So, would you say that capitalism and nature can't coexist?
Not at all. I think broadly that when we talk about capitalism, that we're talking about the ability to have private ownership of property and of land. If anything, what a lot of the work in environmental economics shows us is that when we fail to have well-defined property rights, when a certain natural resource like grassland are open to everyone, then no one feels like they have the responsibility to steward and take care of that resource. It's when we have well-defined property rights that incentives are aligned. If you don't manage the natural resource well, you're going to pay the price now that you have ownership of that property. That doesn't necessarily mean that every single commodity or object in the natural world needs to be monetized and handed over to private individuals, but it doesn't also spell out that capitalism is inherently posed or stands in the way for the environment to flourish.
So, can you share how some of your research has actually influenced some governmental conservation policies? And what is your research focused on going forward?
I've not had many opportunities to get my work out there in front of policymakers, but I do know that some of it has landed on their desk and has helped them make the case the value of nature to humanity is not zero, or what are the impacts of the Endangered Species Act that can then use to have a much more informed discussion. I've also had some work on what scientists think are species that are under threat due to international trade, and who are the species that benefit and get protection under the international treaty. And by constructing that database, that allowed different advocacy groups and different countries to then see where are the gaps, where are some species that scientists think need protection, but the treaty has failed, and start to move through the regulatory mechanisms of the treaty to expand protections to those species. That, I think, has been one of the cases where my work had the most direct impact on policy at the global level. In terms of going forward with my work, I think that I'm going to try and produce many more of these studies that help us to think, how do pollination services benefit us? How do natural enemies provide benefits, things like housing values or timber production? And how those natural enemies are negatively affected by climate change? On how the different policies that we have to safeguard and protect the environment, how effective are they at actually obtaining those policy objectives?
So, lastly, can we as individuals have a real impact on the environmental crisis by the way we make and spend money?
I think the answer to that is yes. You could always find products that have a bit more environmental awareness in terms of their production practices and support that. And that is going to cost more. That's when people are going to need to put some money on the table in order to support some of these environmental considerations. I think that broadly, economics as a discipline tries to tell us how to make the best use of the limited resources that we have. So it's a question of how do we best manage and utilize them. It's also a question of if our choices have a negative impact on the environment and the environment is part of our life support system, then how do we make sure that we're not decimating the thing on which we depend on so strongly? That being said, though, I don't like this idea of individuals are responsible to steward the environment through the use of their wallet. I think that individuals also have a very important tool at their disposal when it comes down to politics. In countries where you can vote and make demands or requests of your politicians, I think it's important that they understand that the public demand serious action and serious policy and serious short-term sacrifice for potential long-term gains when it comes to these environmental outcomes. Without the public spending the time to communicate that to their policymakers and politicians, without the public making it clear that they need to offer serious solutions and not just platitudes when it comes to the environment, we're never going to have serious traction on any of these issues.
I hope you enjoyed this episode with Eyal Frank. And if you are interested in learning more about the work that Eyal is doing and the importance of environmental economics, please visit his website, eyalfrank.com. If you enjoyed this episode of Nature Revisited, please share with friends, family, and colleagues. And please rate us on your favorite podcast server. It will help us to reach a larger audience. You can follow Nature Revisited on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and on our website, nortonproductions.com. And please share your comments and suggestions for future guests for Nature Revisited on the comment section of this episode on our website. The music for this episode is The Machine in the Garden by Ben Cosgrove from his album, The Trouble with Wilderness. The Nature Revisited team consists of Stefan Van Orden, Charles Gagan, and Scott Chasky. And I hope you will join us for the next edition of Nature Revisited. And in the meantime, remember, we are nature.